Well, good evening. Ron right now here. We're going to have another session here on risk management and single pilot resource management. It's chapter 1 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, and it's 8 o'clock, and we'll get started. As before, we have Rich Carlson on the panel. Bert Compton is away. He's not here this evening. Ken Sorensen's back from his regional contest, so he's here. Bob Wander's going to be here. Ron Ridenauer will be hosting it. Question and answers are available during the webinar. You can put them on the website there, and the panel members who can see your questions will either try to answer them or will pose the question during a break in the training. So these are some of the resources that the Soaring Safety Foundation offers. I've presented this the last couple of weeks, and so you can read down through there briefly, but the Soaring Safety Foundation has many programs for you to avail yourself of, especially flight instructors. You know, there's lots of things that you can get on there. I think, you know, I most like the fact you can look at these webinars. One thing, you can see the FERC presentations if you choose to go back and look at some of those, and the videos that Bert Compton made, and the condor-based flight scenarios that Scott Manley made. Those are all excellent pieces of information. So at the end of this, I'll put this slide up one, Ken, at the end, but next week we're going to have, starting at 8 o'clock Central Daylight Savings Time, same place. We're going to do common CFI-G check ride errors and Bob Wander is going to gather from some of the pilot examiners, fighter pilot examiners, and who do flight instructor, glider check rides, and just we're going to kind of pool our resources and talk about the weak areas and some of the areas that are just not satisfactory, so that, you know, they can't get through it the first time. So be thinking about that, and we can put in some comments at the end of the program. I'll put this slide up at the end of the program again. Topics to be discussed tonight. It's on the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, pages 1-1 through 1-29. Defining risk management, the 3P model of pilots, pilot self-assessment, situational awareness, single pilot resource management, aeronautical decision-making, ADM, teaching decision-making skills, assessing single pilot resource management skills, and the chapter summary. So let's jump right into it. Defining risk management, a decision-making process. It is a decision-making process designed to identify hazards systematically, assess the degree of risk, and determine the best course of action. There are identified in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook are 6 different risk categories that we'll talk briefly about. Total risk. Many of the models that we use assess only a portion of the total risk. So, but there are things that we can do to better assess the total risk of any flight. And we'll talk about those as we go through this. So we have identified risk and unidentified risk. Identified risk is a thunderstorm out on course. We may have been forecast, we may have seen it on the radar before we took off. Those are identified risks, and we can mitigate that by changing our course or not flying. Many times you just won't fly in those cases. Unidentified risk is similar thing, only it wasn't forecast. You're just flying cross-country flight, and the weather changes, the lapse rate in that area changes or something like that, and a thunderstorm builds. That would be a good example of an unidentified risk, one that you didn't expect to see or didn't know about. Acceptable risk, and unacceptable risk. Flying is a risky business to some extent. Okay, we can, as best we can mitigate the risks that we know about, and but But there are some unacceptable risks that we should not accept. And a good example of that might be the fact that you're pre-flight in a glider and you notice that the controls don't seem to work correctly. And for whatever reason, maybe, this is kind of an extreme case, but maybe one dive brake opens up fully and the other one only opens up halfway. Well, that's an unacceptable risk, the fact that the controls are not balanced. And so there's no reason to go fly in those cases. That's why we do a pre-flight inspection. And so if you identify something like that, I think I mentioned before a few weeks ago about how I was given a check ride and the applicant, the learner applicant, in this case, I was given the check ride, and he said, this glider spins really well to the left, but it does not spin to the right. And when we went over and when he was doing the pre-flight, I noticed he didn't really move the rudder side to side to full extent. And so I kind of followed along and I moved it. And only about a third of the rudder travel on the one side was there. And the other side, it went way over the normal amount. And so that's an unacceptable risk, when you identify something like that on a pre-flight. So, and then we have residual risks. So those are risks that they're there almost every flight. The possibility that the tow plane might have an engine failure, that's a residual risk. It's there all the time. Possibility that the motor glider engine might fail on takeoff, that's a residual risk that you should be aware of and be prepared for, and be ready to accept that risk and have some kind of a plan of action. That's why we do a takeoff briefing to help us with a plan of action before we take off. Principles of risk management. This is found on page 1-3. Accept no unnecessary risk. And this would be another good example of an unnecessary risk. Flying an unfamiliar sailplane cross country without first practicing landings at the local airport. I mean, you just don't. That's kind of a unnecessary risk. It's, I guess it's not totally unacceptable, but it's unnecessary. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't have practiced some landings at your local airport. Just get familiar with that particular sailplane. Make risk decisions at the appropriate level. There have been times when passengers have influenced the pilot's ability to assess the risks. And so I put on there, don't let passengers make risk decisions for you. Just because they have to get to the meeting, you should have reviewed with them ahead of time the possibility that wasn't going to happen. I'm talking about an airplane now, but flying an airplane, getting there on time. But, in gliders, we have risk decisions to make. And like in competition flying, there have been times when some of the pilots feel that the call for the day was not a good decision on the part of the contest organizers. And so I know of one contest, it doesn't happen very often, but I know of one contest where a number of pilots decided not to go out and fly that day just because they didn't think that it was worth the weather wasn't worth the risk of cross-country flying. So accept risk when benefits outweigh the costs. And I use the example of, those of us who have ever flown at high altitudes, there's a certain amount of risk to flying at high altitudes. The oxygen system may fail, and you risk the running hypoxia, and not recognize it even, and some of those effects that might affect your ability to fly the sailplane. But if you want to go try to get your time in altitude gain, you have to mitigate that risk. You have to have a standby system to mitigate if the oxygen system doesn't seem to be working correctly, or have some kind of plan so that if the if the clouds close in below you, during your high altitude flight, what are you going to do? And so, can you go someplace else, or you should have a plan to go someplace else so you don't have to descend down through the clouds just to get back down. Integrate risk management into all planning at all levels. Uh, and that's kind of be proactive versus reactive type of concept. So the earlier you make risk decisions, like in the pre-flight, you can identify most risks during the pre-flight and make decisions about whether you want to accept those risks or not. So be proactive about it. Don't be reactive. Don't get yourself in a corner someplace and then have to make a reactive type of risk decision. The risk management process. 3 steps to the process. First, identify the hazard, i.e., thunderstorms are in the forecast. So that's something that you should think about, and if they're in the forecast. And sometimes, when we're flying and the weather is good for soaring, you could possibly have thunderstorms in the forecast, whether it's out in the mountains in the Sierras or the Rockies, or whether it's just flying locally. Sometimes there are forecasts for thunderstorms. Then you assess the risk. Are they scattered or squall line? I mean, if they're forecasting scattered thunderstorms, well, you might be able to plan a route that avoids the scattered thunderstorms. But squall lines and other organized thunderstorm activities are very difficult to get around. So, I mean, you have to kind of evaluate, assess the risk, and then mitigate the risk. Is that avoidable? Or, another possibility is just don't fly that day. I mean, in soaring, it's not that there's no reason that we absolutely have to fly. I mean, this is an enjoyable sport. It's a fun sport. It's not like we're trying to do it for a living or anything like that. So, I mean, you may decide that the only acceptable risk is to not fly that day. And then implementing the risk management process. Apply the steps in sequence. Identify, assess, mitigate. Maintain a balance in the process. Are you assessing it, but then just is the mitigation really an acceptable mitigation that'll help you avoid the hazard or not get yourself into trouble? Apply the process in a cycle. So it's, do all 3 steps and try to evaluate all 3 steps fairly. And sometimes then we have to involve other people in the process, a weather briefer, a crew member. Maybe your crew says, hey, my car is broken. We're going to have to figure out some way to, come and get you if you land out. So, I mean, make sure other people, if appropriate, obviously you want to teach the pilots that they're the pilot in command, but many times involving other people will help you make those risk assessments. Identifying the risk using the PAVE. So we've talked about PAVE. We'll continue to talk about PAVE. You'll see that I set up a scenario or 2 using PAVE, and I can't overemphasize that. I know we use PAVE in the flight instructor refresher courses, so it's to help us create scenarios. And so that's one thing we're going to do tonight is create a scenario or 2 using the PAVE checklist. So, but in this case, this is to help you identify some of the risks that are involved with flying. So, P is for pilot. What is your level of experience? What is your level of currency? What is your level of proficiency? Even more importantly, necessarily than currency. Certainly you have to meet some currency requirements, such as the flight review requirement to act as PIC every 24 calendar months. But but that may not be enough. I mean, it's been 23 months since you have last flown. Well, if that flight was to meet your flight review requirements, then certainly you still meet the currency portion of it, but you may not really be proficient. And so, depending upon what exactly you're trying to do, I mean, are you trying to go fly a long cross country flight, or are you flying locally with a friend, or you may want to increase your proficiency. Nonetheless, proficiency is important, and you really should strive to maintain some kind of proficiency. Your physical well-being as well as your emotional well-being. We'll talk more about those later. Using the I am safe checklist, there's I think that you don't. It's kind of, well, it's necessary that you use it, and I refer to regulations 6153 and 9117, which we talked about last week. 6153 requires that you evaluate your personal physical conditions. 9117 is the drugs and alcohol regulations. Aircraft. Airworthiness. Is the aircraft up to speed on inspections? 409 is the annual 100 hours. 911 is the we think it's the altimeter static check, and 91 413 is the transponder check. So if you're carrying a transponder, you have to have an altimeter static check, and you have to have a transponder check too, in accordance with that as well. Aircraft performance, can you carry the planned load? Are you going to load it up with water ballast that day, and is that going to be okay from a weight and balance standpoint and a load standpoint? And are you going to be within the balance limits of the aircraft as well? Aircraft flight manual, it has your assembly and disassembly items in it, besides the other items critical to performance of the sailplane. So don't forget that, if you're assembling the sailplane, make sure you have somebody check the critical pins that's supposed to be in place and safety, and a positive control check as a minimum. I mean, that's the absolute minimum. Obviously, you got to use a checklist, and that's in the aircraft flight manual. So, page 2, still page 1-6 now. The environment, weather, is it soarable? Is there some kind of hazards like thunderstorms or winds? Are the winds aloft such that you can fly safely? So, I mean, there's a lot of different things in the weather. Airport considerations, the runway lengths, the density altitude. You're flying out west, it doesn't take much of a temperature, 90 degrees and 6,000 feet, and your density altitude suddenly shoots up to 8,000 or 9,000 feet. So, I mean, you have to be really cognizant of that. And I know Rich and I have identified a few accidents over the years that we thought were directly related to density altitude, and some of those are related to self-launch type. Generally speaking, the tow plane situation, we kind of know the performance of most tow planes we use, especially out west. But the motor gliders are a different story, and so I think that you, as instructors, people that are going to be instructors in the future, want to make sure that you talk about density altitude and how it affects the performance of the tow operation in particular, as well as the landing operation. So longer runways are necessary. Can't expect as strong a rate of climbs as you can if you're down at sea level and 50 or 60 degrees. So, you have to really be careful about those considerations when you're flying in the mountains or at high density altitudes. Airspace considerations, if you've got a NOTAM that says that there's a VIP in the area causing a TFR, or do you have a NOTAM that says that MOA is active, military operation area is active. We in our glider council meeting the other day, we had a presentation by a controller who talked about some of the airspace limitations and how we as pilots can find out what airspaces are, what precautions we should use if we're going to fly in those airspaces. So find out if they're, number one, find out if they're active or not, and number two, what precautions we might want to take. High altitude considerations, hypoxia and use of oxygen are two big ones. Just the coldness too. I mean, you're going to go to 25,000 feet. It's going to be cold up there. So have you prepared adequately for that? And have you prepared adequately for hydration? You don't want to get dehydrated in cold. That's for sure. Those are things that you don't want to do at altitude, and so you want to stay hydrated. You're going to stay hydrated. You got to figure out some way to relieve yourself as well. So I mean, it's those are all environmental considerations, and if you don't consider them, if you don't teach your learners to make considerations for those, and teach your instructor people that you're going to instruct over the years, we have to consider all those things. And of course, external pressures. Passengers. If passengers have to, if they come out for a nice leisurely ride, and then after they get out there, there's three of them instead of just one. Well, have you do you have an adequate amount of time to accomplish what they want you want to accomplish with them? They want to go fly over their house or something like that. It's 10 miles away from the airport. I mean, if it's not soarable, I mean, how are you going to accomplish that? Or are you going to try to glide out there and glide back in a 233? Probably not. So, I mean, you have to manage their expectations ahead of time. And that's the best way to do it is before you even go, just say, hey, your house is 10 miles away. And this sailplane that we're flying today, we're not going to be able to get over there. And so don't let them talk you into something that you should not be doing. Some pilots have the desire to impress. They've got the macho. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those things. Hazardous thought pattern or some other things like that. And they want to impress. And so your passenger says, hey, I've always seen these low approaches to runways, fast approaches. It looks kind of fun. I've seen it on the internet. Can we do one of those? Well, you know what? We in the Soaring Safety Foundation have a long-standing record of saying no, and even to some extent, to a large extent, the competition group has also gotten away from those low passes especially after a long day. I mean, if you've been in the air 5, 6, 7 hours on a long cross-country flight, you're dehydrated. I don't care how much water or liquid you drink, you're going to be dehydrated, and your decision-making skills are just not going to be as good. And if you fly a low pass across the runway and there's another aircraft landing, whether it's a tow plane or a glider or whatever, I mean, it's a conflict. And so, you just have to resist doing things like that just to impress somebody. So, and I'm not so, I'm going to tell you, in my younger years, I've done those things, but I have chosen to change my way of flying, and I don't do that anymore. And so, and I would encourage you not to do it as well. The desire to satisfy a specific goal, just because you want to try to get your 300-kilometer flight in today, and but if halfway through the flight you're running into storms and things like that, it may be best just to either land at a nearby airport and get a retrieve, or if possible, you could possibly fly back to your home field. while you still have some lift and still have the capability of doing that. So, just remember there's always tomorrow. Don't put your safety at risk to try to go to a specific goal. As pilots, just to a great extent, we are goal oriented. And so we're trying to complete what we started. And so, but sometimes it's more prudent and better decision making will dictate that you abandon that goal and because there's always tomorrow. You can always do it tomorrow or the next day. So the management of external pressures is the single most important key to risk management. It can cause a pilot to ignore all other risk factors combined. So it's really important to evaluate those external pressures before you go and make sure that you don't have any constraints on your flying that are going to cause you to make undue decisions or decisions that might not lead to the success of what you're trying to accomplish. So try to manage that, especially the external pressure part of it. Assessing risk. On page 1-9 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, there's an risk assessment matrix. And it's got the, let me look at it real quick here so that I'm not misquoting what I'm about to say. Along the horizontal of the risk management matrix is the severity. And we'll talk about that second. And on the vertical is the likelihood. So the four likelihood of the events are probable. That's event that will occur several times in a flight. Occasionally, the event will probably occur at some time. Remote, the event is unlikely to occur, but is possible, or improbable. The event is highly unlikely to occur. So you've got the likelihood of the event on the vertical axis, and then the severity of the event on the horizontal axis. And the most severe would be catastrophic, results in fatalities or a total loss of the aircraft. Critical, a severe injury or a minor damage. Marginal, minor injury or minor damage. And negligible, less than minor injury or less than minor damage. So if you kind of divide the matrix into two parts, the upper left-hand corner, in other words, the likelihood the event is probable, the severity of the event is catastrophic. That whole upper left-hand corner, whether it's probable or occasionally or catastrophic or critical, is high on the risk assessment. You have a very high risk if you're up in that area. The kind of the middle then is more in the serious. We'll talk about this event in the next slide, actually. Now, so then if it's remote but catastrophic, it's a serious event. So if it is remote, so it's unlikely to occur, but the severity is catastrophic, well, that's a serious event, But if it's remote or improbable but catastrophic, well, that's a medium event and likelihood of having a risk in those cases. So I would urge you to look at page 1-9 and look at that, and so that you can better not have knowledge about assessing the risk using that risk assessment matrix. So we're going to build a scenario here using the PAVE checklist. The pilot wants to fly a 300K flight. They're a private glider pilot. They have 100 hours total time and flown a 100K flight in the CS, that's the Discus CS, centered around their home airport. So because I use the word centered around their home airport, chances are if you're doing a 100K flight, you're never going to be more than about 25 or 30 at the very most miles away from your home field. So The ability to navigate necessarily isn't all that difficult because you probably can see the home field almost the entire flight. So it's navigation becomes less of a problem. They have the option of flying a dual discus in which they have 50 hours, most of that dual, or a discus CS, which they have only 10 hours in. And that was the aircraft that they flew the 100K flight in. The environment is generally good soaring conditions with winds 10 to 15 knots at a 45-degree angle to the runway direction. However, there is a forecast for 30% chance of thunderstorms. So for a 300K flight, that's maybe a consideration that you want to look at. They need to be home at 1900 for a dinner party that evening. So that's the external pressure we might have. So we're going to look at these one by one. What are the risks and can they be mitigated? The pilot risks. We're going to look at their currency and their proficiency. So, and their navigation awareness. Are they, just because they flew a 100K flight around the home field doesn't necessarily mean that their navigational skills, if they're doing pilotage and dead reckoning versus using a moving map, may not be all that good. And so that's something that you, the instructor, might want to help them assess. So that I remember when I ran a glider, a commercial flight school, we would take people up and they'd profess their wanting to do their silver distance or some other shorter cross-country flight. We'd actually take them on a cross-country flight in the back seat. They could sit in the back seat of the tow plane, and we'd have them navigate using the chart. And so they could have some practice at actually navigating by pilotage. That is reading the chart and seeing the things that are on the ground. And then we could talk about dead reckoning, which is basically flying a course and for a certain amount of time. So you should be able to navigate that way too. I mean, if you're flying on course for 20 minutes and your average ground speed is 40 miles an hour, well, you're going to have gone about 12 to 15 miles in those 20 minutes. So you should have a good idea of where you are about. Time in the aircraft and number of landings. You know, this person admittedly only had 10 hours in the CS, but they had much more experience in the dual discus. And so the dual discus might actually be a better choice in this case. Number one, because they have more time in it and have more landings in it. And number two, they if they thought it was necessary, they might be able to carry another pilot with them or an instructor with them to help them with such things as navigation and things like that. So, I mean, certainly you couldn't do it for a badge flight or something, but certainly you could do it at 300K for proficiency and learning how to utilize pilotage and dead reckoning. So, the aircraft risks. What is the advantage to taking the dual versus the CS? And we just talked about that. You know, we could put an instructor pilot in there if you wanted to, or put an experienced cross-country pilot in there with you, and try to get some information. You know, you could fly the glider, and they could help you with how they think about flying cross-country. You know, maybe where they fly with respect to if there's clouds, where the clouds are at, or if it's just terrain, you know, where they fly with respect to the terrain below you. So versus the CS, I mean, they're kind of, well, they're on their own in the CS, so that's going to be maybe a little more of a learning experience, but it might be safer to fly the dual on this particular day. We have the environmental risks of the winds. Okay, the winds aren't terribly strong, you know, 10 gusted to 15, but they're not calm either. And so they are a consideration. And when you're thinking about winds, you also have to think about winds aloft. So how is that going to affect your cross-country planning and what headings you're going to fly between thermals and things like that. And we have the TRWs and the thunderstorms in the forecast. So that certainly is an environmental risk, and it may, if there's some certain area of the flight or some certain area that the forecast is calling for thunderstorms, you might want to modify the flight in a different direction. Maybe you can make an out and back instead of a triangle, out and back away from the area where the thunderstorms are forecasted to be. So. And we got external risks, and that the big one there is, do you have any retrieve arrangements? The different kinds of retrieve arrangements you can make: aerotow retrieve, a trailer retrieve. So those are some of the risk mitigation things that you can look at ahead of time, and plan using the PAVE checklist. As you can see there, we use the PAVE checklist, and you can hopefully mitigate some of those risks that you've identified. And it might even be that you're decided not to fly today, so which is a valid decision as well. So, flight risk assessment tools. This is a little bit newer, but use of the flight risk assessment tool is it's more to assess your total risk, okay, or the overall risk of the whole flight. And it's a proactive, formal process using pen or paper or online assessment tool. And it gives a perspective of the entire risk picture and is a good way to make a more thorough analysis, okay? Since these webinars go on the internet, there's a flight risk assessment tool that I was able to find. It's on the FAA.gov site. And if you go on the FAA.gov site and you Google flight risk assessment tool, or it will come up with that and others. So, so that particular one creates a numerical score. And if the numerical score is high enough, you'll be in the red. If it's kind of a medium or a little bit less than red, it'll be in the yellow. Or if it's less risk than that, even in the medium risk, it'll be in the green. So if it's in the red, if you have a number that puts you in the red, you really want to try to make some changes to reduce your score. Changes in your flight, whether it's carry an instructor with you, or fly a different sailplane, or fly a different day, or you really want to try to really reduce your score in a serious manner, and even up to and including canceling the flight. So that's one reason to use that kind of assessment tool. I know a friend of mine who's a corporate pilot. He said his corporate department, just recently instituted a FRAT, flight risk assessment tool, and in their corporate world, and a couple of times he's had to call the management, his chief pilot, saying that, hey, I've done the FRAT and I'm up in this red thing, and I think we need to do something else. I think, and one thing that he did was he chose to go to a different airport, because the airport that they were planned for had short runways, and there was another airport that was nearby that had much longer runways, and they were going to be on better approaches to those runways. He's going to be able to land there, he felt, in a safer manner, and then Uber the passengers over to the meeting that they're going to. So in soaring, we don't necessarily have those kinds of external pressures. And then we have Sirius, or yellow, and that begin by mitigating some of the high scored items. So again, if you can mitigate the high scored items, you might get it back down into the green, where you can feel more comfortable flying the flight that day. So, but it again, This FRAT tool is to assess the overall risk of a flight, and not just maybe just the individual items of the flight, but an overall risk. And sometimes the individual items can add up enough where the overall risk is much higher, much more serious. So, or if you get green score, well, then flight can depart. But and consider areas that can changes that could be made to reduce the risk. So um, that's still a possibility to reduce the risk. Okay, I'm going to take a break here. Does anybody have any questions on the panel? Do you have anything, or should we press on?
There have been no questions posted yet.
Okay. So the 3P model for pilots. 3P model is perceives the given set of circumstances for the flight, processes by evaluating the impact of those circumstances on flight safety, and performs by implementing the best course of action. So in the first step, the goal is to develop situational awareness by perceiving hazards and using the PAVE to evaluate those hazards. So if you can look at the hazards, and then maybe one of the hazards is the fact that you have to you have a strong crosswind on the runway, but there's another airport nearby, a couple of miles away, that doesn't have a strong crosswind on the runway. So maybe it's best to go over there and land and bring the trailer over to retrieve the glider. So I mean, you have to. You don't want to think about convenience. My friend Bert Compton, who's not here today, his father used to always tell him, we don't do things for convenience, because usually convenience leads to less or higher risks. And so just because it's convenient to land on a 3,000-foot runway and then take off straight ahead with only 1,500 feet remaining doesn't necessarily mean that that's the least risk. And so sooner or later you do that. Hey, it's hey, we got away with it this time. Hey, we got away with it next time. Well, then, the 100th time, the engine of the tow plane fails, and now you're out there at 100 feet off the end of the runway with lesser options than you might have had you had the entire runway available to you for taking off. So, in the second step, the goal is to process this information to determine if the hazard constitutes a risk. And so, only using half the runway, if it's a shorter runway, does constitute a risk. In the third step, the goal is to perform by taking action to eliminate the hazards and mitigate the risk. So, again, it just I use the runway example. We at our field have a very short runway, so we don't even have the option of landing and not pulling back because the runway is just too short. But there are many operations where people, you can do that, and 99 times out of 100, the risk is minimal. But you have to consider that time when it's not. And so some days it might be less risky if you have a strong wind down the runway. It might be less risky because you're not going to use as much runway for the landing or the takeoff. But it's something that you should consider no matter what. After you've gone through the 3 steps, you turn around, the decision process begins again. The decision-making process is a continuous loop of information. Self-assessment. We're generally, we can be pretty good at self-assessing if we're honest with ourselves and not trying to operate in a little riskier situation. So, setting personal minimums is an important step in mitigating risks. If you have set the personal minimums that you don't want to take off at anything less or greater than a 10 knot direct crosswind and today the crosswind is 12 knots. Well, what are you going to do? You know, it's I think to some extent you have to evaluate that and say, well, I made a decision in the comfort of my living room in an easy chair that I didn't want to take off at anything greater than 10 knots. And today it's 12 knots. And so therefore, the only way to mitigate that risk is not operate. Maybe you could operate with an instructor on board if you had a two-place sailplane, and that would allow you to possibly consider increasing your limits a little bit. But you really need to really try to stick with your personal minimums. Just like a pre-flight aircraft checklist, a personal minimums checklist is a useful tool to evaluate his or her readiness for to fly the aircraft. And in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook in Appendix D is a personal minimums checklist. And it follows the PAVE checklist in format. So it talks about the pilot first, the aircraft second, the environment third, and external pressure. So you might want to refer to that. Appendix D of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook has a personal minimums checklist listed in there. Situational awareness. So we all have to maintain a degree of situational awareness, and I think that it's incumbent upon instructors to watch and make sure that their learners are maintaining that situational awareness at all times, or as best they can. So some of the obstacles to maintaining their situational awareness: fatigue. I'll tell you, that's in my opinion, that's one of the biggest obstacles that we had to deal with as airline pilots, because we were flying long haul, legs, and we had a third pilot or sometimes a fourth pilot on board to relieve our relief pilot, and that was mainly there so the other two pilots fly, and the one relief pilot goes and rests for 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever the rest period is. And if you're a little fatigued, you really want to try to get some sleep. So it impairs your alertness and your performance. Increased errors of omission, followed by errors of commission, and micro sleeps or involuntary sleep lapses from a few seconds to a few minutes. And I don't know about you, but I've had a few times in driving the car, pretty boring, pretty and I've had micro sleeps. It kind of scares me, actually, to be quite honest, and it should. And haven't had an accident yet, but obviously that's a possibility. The only effective treatment for fatigue is adequate sleep. So, I mean, if you feel like you're fatigued, seriously consider not flying that day. I mean, you have to be honest with yourself. And just because it's a booming soaring day, if you only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep the night before, chances are today, I don't care how good a day it is, it's not for you. That's not the day for you, because fatigue is very important. That it leads to performance errors. Complacency is an overconfidence from repeated experience on a specific activity. So some of the advanced avionics that we have might promote inattention and complacency. I mean, most of the cross-country soaring sailplanes that we use have moving maps, and so they tend to promote a lack of attention to exactly where you are as far as trying to do pilotage and use a chart. I know I always carry a chart, to be quite honest with me, whether it's electronic or a paper chart. I usually carry a paper chart, has the turn points depicted on it if I'm in a contest. And it helps with pilotage, and it helps with, alerting me when, even though the airspaces that might be restrictive are on the chart or on the moving map, sometimes the chart is really important because you can see some of the things on the ground, which are an indication of where that airspace might be. So, operational pitfalls. They list at least a dozen of them in there. These are just a few. Peer pressure. That's peer pressure can lead to as an obstacle for situational awareness. Mindset. If you've got your mind focused on, hey, I'm going to get there-itis, you might not maintain your situational awareness. I mean, I know a pilot friend of mine, he was so focused on getting there to the finish line. I mean, he was going to get to the finish line no matter what. And he landed about a mile short of the runway in a field and did not put his gear down because he didn't realize that he was that low and that he wasn't going to make it. And so it's a mindset. You have to relax and open up your mind. And I know that's hard to believe that someone would do that, but you get so focused on the goal at hand that you lose situational awareness about where you really are and how high you really are, and et cetera, et cetera. Getting behind in the aircraft, that's a big one. We talk about it as an instrument pilot, but even in glider flying, we can get behind the aircraft, and so you want to make sure that you don't do that, and you don't lose your positional or situational awareness. I mean, especially if you're gaggle flying. I mean, that's a big area that you really have to be on your A game, as I say it. Because if you lose your positional or situational awareness with respect to the other aircraft that are in that gaggle of thermal with you, it's not what you want. You neglect things such as flight planning, pre-flight inspections, or checklists. Those are all areas where you get so focused on things that you forget to do the landing checklist. And part of the landing checklist was put the wheel down, and you end up landing hopefully in the grass. If you're going to land with the gear up, you land in the grass with the gear up, and it's usually not too bad. But I know again of a pilot who was he just bought a brand new glider, and on his second flight, he was so focused on landing that he landed with the gear up on pavement and made a nice white stripe down the runway and round off some gel coat and fiberglass in the meantime. So, not a good thing. Single pilot resource management, sometimes referred to as SRM. This is page 1-15, 5P checklist. We got the plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, the programming. And if you read the book, and hopefully you've all read the book, it says that you use the 5P checklist as a scheduled review at key decision points during the flight. You use it during pre-flight. What is my plan? What's the plan? Pilot, passengers, programming. Pre-takeoff, important to have pre-briefed the pilot or the passengers for sure. Done a pre-brief takeoff, pre-takeoff brief for the pilot, right? Programming, you want to make sure that the GPS is programmed if you're doing that before you have to make the takeoff. So, I mean, this is part of the reason we do the 5P checklist at certain points in key decision points during the flight. And hourly or at the midpoint of the flight. I mean, if the whole flight's only going to be an hour, maybe do it at the midpoint. If it's going to be several hours, well, hourly, just kind of run down through the 5P checklist and make sure that you're still on track for what you're trying to do. So, and then pre-descent and when entering the traffic pattern are the other two key decision points to review the 5P checklist. So we got informational management, task management, and automation management. So informational management are things like weather pre-briefing, uh, looking at the fighter flying manual, make sure you're familiar with the instrumentation in the sailplane and the weight and balance information and the assembly information, things like that. So there's a lot of informational management things that you want to think about while you're as a single pilot. So, task management, you don't want to get overwhelmed by the tasks. Uh, if you're trying to deal with, usually when you get task saturated, you're getting low and you're trying to figure out where's a good place to land and where's there still some lifts that you might be able to work. Um, there's many tasks to do when you're in those last few um minutes of a flight, and so that's one reason to do it ahead of time. Once you get down to 2,000, feet, start to look around for a field while you're looking for lift. If you get down to 800 to 1,000 feet, you got to, and again, my friend Don's, he's got a retractable gear. He puts his wheel down and runs a landing checklist when he makes the decision that he's going to land, because that'll unload some of the tasks that he has to do. Now he can concentrate on the landing and not concentrate on still trying to soar. So, and then automation management. We have moving map GPSs. We've got all kinds of sophisticated hardware in our sailplanes these days to help detect where the lift is. The Hawk variometer uh, program, all sorts of different things that we have that if we're going to use that automation efficiently and effectively, we should be familiar with it. We should be familiar with the steps that it takes to program it in an efficient manner, and how to use it then, how to use it to your advantage versus get so distracted by the automation that you get overwhelmed with the task at hand. And so be careful not to let the automation overwhelm you, especially in a single pilot operation. So ADM is a systematic approach to the mental process used by aircraft pilots to consistently determine the best course of action in response to a given set of circumstances. You can see a lot of these concepts that we talk about overlap each other, and that definition is definitely an overlap of the three P's, right? Perceive, see if I can remember them now, process, and perform. And as you can see, it's a mental process as well, and just like aeronautical decision making is a systematic approach to that kind of mental process. Define the problem, choose a course of action, and implement the decision and evaluate the outcome. So, like I said, again, it's very similar to the 3P model that we talked about earlier. Factors affecting the decision making process is recognizing hazardous attitudes. We've got the 5 hazardous attitudes that the FAA talks about: machoism, anti-authority. Macho, hey, I'm good enough to do anything I want. Anti-authority is, hey, just because that's a rule doesn't mean that rule affects me. Invulnerability, well, I can do anything. I don't have to worry about risks. Impulsivity, do it now, do it now. I got to do it now. Well, sometimes doing it now is not the best course of action. Relax and evaluate a little bit more. Oh, resignation. Oh, what's the use? It's what's going to be is going to be, and I don't have much ability uh, to change the outcome. So try to if you think you have some machoism, try to relax, and don't don't be so self-assured. So anti-authority, we have rules for a reason. That's because usually it's because other people have made mistakes and the FAA has made a rule about it. So be careful. Invulnerability, we all have faults and we're all vulnerable to certain things. So I mean, don't feel that you can handle every little situation. You are not invulnerable. Impulsivity, again, don't do things so quickly. Sometimes it's better to the tow rope break at 200 feet or 300 feet. Well, an immediate return to the field might not be the best course of action. So don't be so impulsive to do that. In resignation, remember you can make a difference and you should work to strive to make a difference. And then stress management affecting decision making. We have physical stress, physiological stress, and psychological stress. So, physical stress is just the mental, or not the mental, but the physical demands that it takes to fly sailplanes for long periods of time. And I can tell you from experience, the older I get, the more physical stress I feel, and that's one reason to try to stay somewhat physically fit, because it is stressful to fly for great periods of time, long periods of time, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours at one time. It's just physically stressful to do that. So psychological stress, there again, it's mentally challenging to be concentrating for a long period of time to try to keep that aircraft in the air. I mean, you're always fighting gravity. 100% of the time you're flying, you're fighting gravity. And so you have to be able to think about that psychological, because it is stressful. It's stressful to having to be thinking about where am I going to land, or I'm flying in the mountains and I have fewer options of where to land and things like that. So uh, physiological stress is definitely something that you have to manage, and then psychological stress. If you arrive at the airport and you're already under some kind of psychological stress, you had an argument with your son or your wife or your child, or you're having a bad day at work, and now you come out to fly after that bad day at work. You've got those things in your mind. You don't have room. We only have a certain amount of room to handle stress, and so if you've already got some stress going on, it will take less periods of stress to exceed the stress limits for any human being. And so we try to manage that stress. And again, when I was a instructor at my glider school, I would notice that the people who would come out after work uh, usually didn't do as well as they did if they came out on a weekend when they had less stress in their life. They're fighting traffic on the way out from work, trying to get there before their flight lesson that they had arranged for, and even though they knew that we would be ready, it just they might have things that were going on at work, and then add to that the ride in the car to come out to fly. So aeronautical decision making continued. Use of resources. We have internal resources we can use, such as checklists, instrument markings. That's our placards. That's something that people forget about on check rides. The fact that we have instrument markings. The airspeed instrument is marked off in different arcs. Whether you have flaps, you got a white arc. Red line is the maximum, never exceed speed. Green arc, the normal operating range. Things like that. So remember, you have instrument markings as well as checklists. The POH, right? You can always, it's not usual that you would actually get out the POH in a flight situation, but you might get it. Well, you should get it out like for a pre-flight inspection, or you should get out for an after assembly inspection or during assembly. So we have those kinds of internal resources, aeronautical charts, whether they're electronic or paper charts, and other people. If you're carrying passengers, maybe they can help you look out for traffic, reduce your stress about that. If you have an instructor, assign him or her a duty to do. You might have other pilots flying with you that can help you with cross country flying. And so think about some of the internal resources that you have while you're flying. External resources, you might, you have ATC. You can always get on the radio and talk to them if you're concerned about the situation. Flight service station might is available to look at your weather. You also have ATIS, automatic terminal information services, and AWAS, automatic weather observation services. And so you have some of those that you can utilize externally, resources to help you with managing your flight, so making good decisions. And then workload management, planning, prioritizing, and sequencing tasks to avoid work overload. So if you know that you're coming into a situation where your workload is going to get higher, such as you're approaching a gaggle of their other sailplanes, well, you know that your workload is going to be higher when you're in there just trying to avoid trying to work the lift and trying to avoid a mid-air collision. So plan ahead. How do I want to enter the gaggle of fighters? Prioritize, following one glider in a formation kind of flying, and then sequence yourself into the gaggle to avoid work overload. I've seen, and I'm sure we all have, that those of us who have flown in contests and other gaggle type situations, you have some pilots who don't sequence themselves in, and that just increases our workload that much more, just trying to avoid whatever they're trying to do. So it's really important to try to, in those situations of gaggle flying, to manage your workload. Teaching decision-making skills. So systems safety of flight training occurs in 3 phases. First, the traditional stick and rudder maneuvers. When we first came out with PTS and ACS and things like that, the big concern, I won't say concern, the big complaint that flight instructors talked about was the fact that we were putting more emphasis on decision making, risk management skills, and not enough on the traditional stick and rudder skills. But I disagree with that. I think that we're adding another layer of training rather than detracting from that traditional stick and rudder. I think it's very important that we teach traditional stick and rudder skills to all learners, because that's one way that they can relieve their stresses and things like that that they might encounter. The more relaxed they are at their actual ability to fly the aircraft, the more aware they'll be, situationally aware, and have more brain power to devote to things like stress and other things, risk management, decision making while they're flying. So, and then in the second phase, the learners begin to understand how best to identify hazards, manage risk, and use all available resources to make each flight as safe as possible. So, in the first step, you're basically just teaching them how to fly. In the second, now you're trying to incorporate, they've got a pretty good idea about how to stick and rudder skills and how to fly. Now you're trying to incorporate some of the things that we're talking about tonight: managing risks, making good decisions, and so So we get to the second level of second phase, and we're introducing some of these ideas and concepts. And then in the third phase, the learners are introduced to more complex scenarios that focus on several safety of flight issues at the same time, such as, you're entering the approach or entering a pattern for approach and landing, and we already have things that we have to consider. Just managing the risks, the flight path that we want to fly on the approach, and to make a safe landing. And so, but just as we enter the downwind leg, we notice another glider in the traffic pattern ahead of us. And so now we have to manage that risk as to where they're going to land. One of the things that we can do, if we have radios and they have radio, we can ask them what their plan is, and make sure that they're aware of the fact that you're right behind them and going to land right behind them. So maybe they can modify their plan a little bit and help you help themselves and help you too with where they're going to go. So it's a little more complex scenario than just doing the landing by yourself, and it gives you an opportunity to watch the learner, you the instructor, watch the learner, and see how they manage that extra risk that's there. And scenario-based training helps instructors effectively teach aeronautical decision-making and risk management skills as well. And we're going to talk specifically about that here next. Assessing single pilot resource management skills. So instructors should learn how to assess on a different level. The level that we initially assess at is the stick and rudder skills. And so now we need to assess at the resource management skills or the risk management skills. How did the learner arrive at a particular decision? That's you create a scenario, you ask them to analyze it and make decisions about it. How did they arrive at that decision? What resources did they use? Did they have in a landing pattern, did they have the resource of, besides looking at the windsock, did they have resource maybe listening to the AWAS ahead of time to help them determine what runway they were going to use and what the traffic pattern might look like? Was the risk assessed accurately when making a go and no-go decision? I mean, if you ask them to assess the risk, hey, we got a 20-knot crosswind, direct crosswind on the runway today, what are you going to do? And if they say, well, I don't know, what would you do, Mr. Instructor? Well, that's not necessarily, that's an indication that they're not really ready to make some of those go, no-go decisions. Whereas if they just point blank say, hey, that's above my personal limit, and my personal limit's only 10 knots of direct crosswind. Well, now they've made a good, they made a go, no-go decision based on their personal limits, which they had previously determined. Did the learner maintain situational awareness in the traffic pattern? We talked briefly about that already. Was the workload managed effectively during a cross-country flight? There's different phases in all cross-country flights that I've ever flown, and you've got a phase of usually when you first start out, sometimes the lift is a little weaker, and so you maybe have to take it a little more carefully as you go along. And in the middle of the day, when the lift is stronger, you can you go a little faster, and you get a little faster cross country speed. And many times when you get and near the end of the day, you want to manage the work load by staying high usually, so that you can work the high lift, because a lot of times the lift is still up high, but it's not nearly as strong down low. So how does the learner handle stress and fatigue? If they arrive at the field and their eyelids are half closed, well, I as an instructor, I think I have a responsibility for saying, hey, how'd you sleep last night? And they'd say, if they said something like, well, had to stay up and do a big project for work, and I only got about 5 or 6 hours last night. And I feel a little tired today. Well, maybe today is not the best day to go flying. Did they make that decision, or did you make that decision? So make sure that the learner understands about fatigue and handles stress as well. Use scenario-based training to evaluate the learner's ADM skills. So try to create scenarios. We talked about a couple of scenarios when we were earlier today in this lesson, and that helps you evaluate their aeronautical decision-making skills. Use learner self-assessment to help evaluate learners through the process, and behavior. So, their assessment is usually pretty accurate. And we as instructors want to have them assess themselves, assess their progress before I think many times before we actually give our opinion, because that's the one way that we can perceive how they're learning and how they're progressing. So it's really important that they use that learner self-assessment tool. Single pilot resource management grades based on 4 components. So if you look at the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, it talks about, can they explain to you what they're trying to do? So that would be the basic grade. Can they then put that explanation into practice? Would be a second level grade of assessment. Can they then manage and decide the errors that they're making and look at, we'll just use the traffic pattern for an example. And they explain what they're looking for when they enter into the traffic pattern, the fact that they have to do a landing checklist and look for other traffic. And then after they explain that on the ground, can they put that into practice? And when they get to the manage and decide level of single pilot resource management, they're making decisions such that if there's another aircraft on the runway or some kind of conflict in the pattern, or they get in the pattern too low or from the wrong side, and they make a decision. Do they make a decision to overfly the airport just to fly the standard pattern, or do they make a decision to fly a pattern that's on the wrong, the opposite side of the airport, not necessarily the wrong, but the opposite side of the airport, because it's safer, and make sure that they call out on the radio and be extra vigilant for other aircraft who might be in a regular pattern. So, but it might be safer for them to decide to change their pattern from one side of the airport to the other. And that leads us to this chapter summary. This chapter introduced aviation instructors to the underlying concept of safety risk management, which the FAA is integrating into all levels of aviation. So as we go forward, that's important stuff. We've looked at the source materials, references. We've talked about that before as well. Future schedules. So we've got this one more session. Backed by popular demand, there's been several requests made from people who are obviously serious about trying to get their instructor's certificate, maybe this season or this fall. Common errors that DPEs have found. So Bob Wonder is going to organize the people to call some DPEs and get some ideas from them. And we're also interested in your questions specifically. What questions you ask specifically to the DPEs, because this is a good time to get those questions answered. So we'll try to have a couple of DPEs on the panel next week. We've got several, that I'm aware of, and I'll try to get a few that, and Bob's going to help me work on that. The Aviation Instructor's Handbook and a Flight Instructor's Glider PTS. So, questions? Do we have any questions from the panel? The silence is deafening.
Well, it just popped up. Gotta mute. Just one popped up in the SRM grades not observed, an event not accomplished or required. Can you explain or expand on what the not observed element of the grading is?
The not observed. Oh, okay. On that last slide. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. So not observed would be just that if you're grading their single pilot resource management, you may not have observed some component that you might think is important. So it might get to the point where uh, they they did it by omission versus commission, and you would want to maybe create a scenario that would get that kind of assessment involved, um, so that you can observe their ability to um, make good decisions in that area. So sometimes you don't have everything. You're not making decisions in all the areas that you may want to be looking at in any given situation. And so sometimes you have to create a scenario that scenario-based training, use scenario-based training to uh, observe what they might do in those situations.
So one of the things that has occurred to me in the last year or two is that while we've talked about this SRM, CRM for many years, seems to have been more of an afterthought when we're doing our flight training. What I've decided to do is on the very first lesson, start discussing this and put it into practice in the first landing, which I'm doing. So they are then tasked with doing the lookout. And so I can start to demonstrate how we can use SRM, CRM concepts in flight and just lay the foundation for later on in their training when they start doing more and more of the decision-making skills.
That's really a good observation, Rich, and that's you're absolutely correct, and that's what the FAA wants us to do. That's what we should do as instructors, is to integrate this from day one as best we can. Another area that I found that many times a learner will call me and say, "Gee, what do you think about the weather today?" And my response to that is, well, I have an opinion, but really I want your opinion about what the weather today looks like. I mean, what's your evaluation of that? Because you need to make sure that you're gradually transferring those areas of responsibility over to them so that they're equipped to make those decisions on their own when it comes time to make those decisions on their own. And so um, or if you get out to the field and you say to the learner, "Hey, this aircraft was just assembled this morning, and nobody's flown it yet. What do you think we should do?" And before we go fly it. And so it gives you, the instructor, a way to evaluate how you've taught them and to whether they are serious about doing checklists, doing the critical assembly check, and doing the positive control checks, and using the checklist to make sure that the aircraft was assembled correctly and things like that. So I mean, I try to throw some of those questions right back in their neighborhood, and so that and then allow them to tell me what they would do and why they would do it. And that's what we have to do as instructors, to try to resist making decisions for them, especially. It's okay initially, to make a few decisions, but I think it's important for us as instructors to push that decision making off on them as quickly as we can, just like Rich mentioned, and try to force them to make decisions for themselves. Well, I wouldn't fly today because I've decided that I don't want to fly with greater than 5 knots of crosswind. Well, that's fine. That's their decision to make. And again, like if they come, I can't tell you the number of times applicants have called me as the examiner to say, "Well, Mr. Examiner, what do you think we should do today?" And as an FAA representative, I can't make that decision for them. I just tell them, well, unfortunately, I can't make the decision for you. You're the pilot in command, and you have to make the decision. And maybe if you decide you want to go fly, I'm going to go, and I don't think it's unsafe. I'm going to go fly. And if you decide you don't want to go fly, I'm going to look at it as a item that you've looked at and considered carefully, and you've made a safety related decision. And I'm going to say, okay, good for you. You know your limits, you know your abilities, you know what you can and cannot do, and or should and should not do, and you've made a decision based on all those experiences and teachings and everything else that you've learned through the course of your instruction. And so I think, like I said, as an examiner, I can't make the decision for them. I'm not allowed to, and nor do I want to. I actually want to see what their decision making. If they decide to go fly a 15-knot crosswind, I might ask them a few questions like, so what is the crosswind limitations on this glider? The max crosswind limitation on this glider, or how much wind have you flown in, or I might make ask a few inquiries like that, but I'm not going to make the decision for them. I can't make the decision for them. And as you progress as an instructor, as you progress in the teachings of your learners, you should make fewer and fewer lessons and fewer and fewer decisions, and force the decision making process on them.
Ron, this is Ken. I had another point to make, which is sort of relevant.
Excellent.
In terms of the cockpit resource management or the single pilot resource management. I think it's important to remind students that your resources extend outside of the cockpit. Where that came up for me that was interesting is my son was in the Air Force flying F-16s and single place airplanes. And one of the things that he said that they do is when they're flying with the wingman, if they have a problem, they can actually transfer some of the duties to the wingman or vice versa. So that basically they transfer part of their navigation or radio, whatever it is. So if you're fighting a problem in your airplane, you let the wingman take care of the stuff that you're now maxed out on and can't deal with. And the same thing would apply flying single seat gliders, in the sense that, there may be another glider in the area. You may be able to contact somebody on the ground if you're, landing at your home field and get input by the ground people on the radio. You could be able to call air traffic control and get help. So if you have a problem and you're trying to deal with the problem, it's possible to reach outside of the cockpit, even though you're in a single seat airplane.
That's a good point, Ken, and that's you're absolutely correct. You do have resources outside the cockpit, and they extend in many different directions, and those are two good points. I know that I've got a little bit of formation flying with me as well, and that's exactly correct. What you said is exactly correct. You can put the responsibility, have them help you with some of the responsibilities and duties. So. But and sometimes, as in international competitions, actually try to team fly, and that's a difficult. It's been difficult for us in the United States to develop good team flying skills, but those team flying skills can transfer some of the decision making outside the cockpit, and you can share the load, so to speak, with you and your teammates. So it's or in the case of two dual two place contests or something like that. I mean, if you've got another pilot in the aircraft with you, you can uh, push some of the responsibilities on them to help you watch out for other traffic, or like you said, take over some of the radio duties and um, try to get the weather at the ahead or in the area. So I mean, there's many resources that can be in the cockpit that you can utilize as well, and outside the cockpit.
So we do have a question, Ron. How do you make sure the instructor doesn't become an external pressure when giving dual instruction, I guess?
Well, sometimes that might be actually a good thing that the instructor, is an external pressure, and I'm sure that the pilot examiner, in many cases, is an external pressure because the applicant is there to perform and to perform within the um, PTS standards, and so I think that sometimes a distraction of the examiner or the instructor can be a good thing, and I I'm not sure that you necessarily want to mitigate that. If hey, to some extent you want to mitigate that, you try to um, as Ken pointed out, if you have two people in the cockpit, one person, you can help with collision avoidance, watching outside the cockpit for other aircraft and things like that. Um, it's I think ultimately, especially in the gliding world, you want to develop this concept of single pilot resource management as much as you can, and decision making skills, and if you're a distraction as an instructor, you're an distract and you don't want to be a distraction, well then you're going to have to try to talk to your learner, talk to your student, and see what's going on in their life. Maybe it's not you at all, but maybe it's just some other physiological pressure or psychological pressure or something like that that they're dealing with. It's increasing their stress level to the point where you, the instructor and or the examiner, are pushing them over their limits for stress, and that creates a distraction. So I guess I'm not sure. Like I said, I think sometimes it's probably a good thing that the instructor tries to be somewhat of a distraction.
Well, I think what you're trying to say is that you need to work up this gradually. You can't do this on flight two. So you need to understand where the skill is, what the applicability or attitude, currency, proficiency of the applicant is. What have they been trained on? If we're providing the instruction, we need to be able to shut up and sit back and let them make decisions and not continually yammer at them from the back seat. So there are things we can do in learning the instructional skills that we need to provide the right kind of training environment that they can learn effectively, intervene when we need to, but not become such of a burden that they can't actually learn anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know I've had instructors, who are overbearing, so to speak, and trying to nitpick every little detail of what's going on. And so it's like you said, Rich, sometimes it's a very fine line to some extent. You're trying to make sure that they do things correctly, so that they don't learn something incorrectly. And but it's a very fine line because you want to make sure that they're also have the ability and the confidence in their own ability to move forward on their own. You know, a lot of times I see at the pilot examiner level, I see. I mean, it's not uncommon for me to in the airplane world. Your person has to have 10 hours of solo time and a total of 40 hours of total time, and it's not uncommon for me to see an applicant come in with 50, 60, 70, 80 hours of dual and 10.1 hours of solo. And I find those applicants, to be quite honest, um, not not as confident in their own ability as applicants who might have 20 or 30 hours of solo, even though 10 is the minimum, and a like a number of hours of dual, 20 or 30 hours of dual, maybe for a total of 60 hours, half of which was solo, half of which was dual. Because I don't care whether they think they're making the decisions or not. When you're flying in a dual situation, um, that person, that learner, is subconsciously not being the pilot in command. Whether they think they are or not, the instructor pilot is the pilot in command for the most part. And so it's I find that they don't those people with a lot of dual time and just the bare minimum solo time um, are not as confident. In the glider world, that I find the people that are more confident in their abilities are the people who can have gotten up and soared on their own, and maybe did some, maybe have 8 or 10 hours of dual, 5 or 6 hours of dual and 8 or 10 hours of solo time, a lot of which was just flying, in thermals and seeking out thermals and thermaling and flying from place to point to find thermals. And those people, in my experience, have a lot more confidence than the people who stick close to home and only fly on nearly calm days when maybe there's not much left. And if you look, all their flights are 10 or 15 minutes. And it's not that they're poor pilots, it's just that they don't have uh, it seems like the pilots who have had been up on days when they could find lift and work the lift and things like that, they just seem to have more confidence in their ability.
Uh,
Yeah, can you guys hear me over?
Yes, we can now.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just a quick note. I make a point in instruction to look the candidate in training straight in the eye when it's time for me to hand over responsibility for the safe performance of any given task to that candidate. For instance, it might be the takeoff roll and climb out during aero tow, including the successful release from the tow plane. I look them straight in the eye and say, this is now yours. I've shown you how it's done. You've read the books. You've gone to the ground school. You've had to practice. You know what to do. So I have no intention of interfering. This is on you now, okay? And so they get the message. Like I said, I look them straight in the eye and tell them. Then going back to the question that Rich brought up about 4 minutes ago, should the instructor or is sometimes the instructor an external pressure? Yeah, I am. That's my job. Once I know the guy can handle it, the candidate, I beg your pardon, can handle it without any curveballs, I start throwing him curveballs. I have the tow pilot throttle back a little bit to simulate a partial power loss in the tow plane. I don't tell the candidate in the front seat of the glider that, but I've trained the candidate to recognize that situation. You see what I mean? I asked the tow pilot to make steeper turns than normal during aero tow so that the candidate will say, oh, well, I didn't expect this, but I was warned it might happen. I will handle this. So to get back to the question about 4 or 5 minutes ago from one of the attendees, your job as instructor, once you've handed over responsibility for a particular task, is A, to monitor the candidate's performance of the task, and then B, to throw them a little bit of a curveball now and then, to be the external pressure that will present them problems that they didn't anticipate that they have to solve. That's part of single pilot resource management. That's what I wanted to add. Over.
Thanks, Bob. Very good. Very succinct. I kind of ramble on sometimes, but that's a very succinct way of saying it. Thank you. Well, I think the panel that I know is there have all spoken tonight, and I appreciate your participation. I think you all had very good points to make, and I appreciate that. Like I said, next week we're going to talk about some of the things that we see as examiners, and I've already talked to some extent on some things, but I know I have a laundry list that I've made up over the years, and I'll probably go down through that. I will go down through that. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up about some of the things that I've seen, and I know some of the examiners have seen that are weak areas. Sometimes the weak areas are disqualifying. Sometimes the weak areas are something that I feel that we can talk about after the check ride is over, after the evaluation is over, and assuming that it was a positive evaluation, it still may be that I need to, reinforce the fact that some of the observations I made were that could have been improved. So, but we'll talk about those areas that improvement could be noted and could be practiced, and in those areas that are just disqualifying. And I know it's a judgment call. I do have the guidance of the PTS, but it is still boils down to some extent as a judgment call on the part of the examiner. So, well, I've overstepped an hour and 45 minutes. I'd say it's time, unless we have other questions. I've got up on the board there, and you can hopefully you've copied down just one of those. You don't have to comment to every one of us, but if you want to comment to one of us, any questions that you might have for next week, we'll compile those questions and we'll make sure that we answer them. And even if you don't think of a question ahead of time, during the presentation, if you think of a question, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll try to stop the presentations at certain points and make sure that any questions you might have are addressed. So,
Ron, I want to hear.
yes.
Just a remark to the participants. If you could send your questions by email to either Ron or Rich Carlson or myself by, let's say, Sunday night this coming, that's about 3.5, 4 days for you to to prepare your questions and send them along. That will give your team of presenters a day or two to confer and try and come up with the best possible answers for your questions. So if at all possible, if you can send in your questions in the next roughly basically 3 days, 3.5 days, that would be great, because then we will do our best. Ron is the leader here. I'm just one of the helpers, but that would help us confer and try and give you the best possible answers, the best possible resources to allow you to make your dream of becoming a glider flight instructor come true. Over.
Yep. Thanks for those comments, Bob. I agree. And I've left it up here, the email addresses, and it may make any difference if you think you can communicate better with one or the other of us. That's fine. So, or send them to all three of us if you have time to write all three of our email addresses down. So, with that, unless we have any other further comments by the panel members, I think we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much for your participation all these weeks. I've actually learned a lot, to be quite honest. It's gotten me back in the books to extent, and I've enjoyed getting back in the books and learning a few things that I had forgotten or not thought of the way that I should have been thinking about it. And so it's it's been a great review for me as well, and I hope it's been a good review for you. So we'll see you next May 7th, and then beyond that, I'll kind of I'd like to do something probably in the fall about talking about maneuvers and actual lessons. You know, how do you plan a whole flight lesson and things like that to give you some clues about how to go about that, because I know that Rich and I and other experienced and Bob, all experienced instructors, have a lot of thoughts and ideas about that. And, you know, we talked about the fact that you should follow some kind of curriculum and have some kind of lesson plans so that you give a complete presentation to your learner. And so at any rate, we'll, in the fall, after the flying season is winding down, I think my plan right now is to start up again for a few weeks, you know, 3, 4, 5 weeks to try to get through some of the more difficult things just about how to fly on tow and how to make a slip to landing and things like that. So without further ado, I think we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much.
Good night, all.